The ship had no name the way human ships had names. It was called the Kelvorn, which in the Solhari language simply meant a place to watch from. That was all it was built to do: watch, record, stay hidden. It sat in low orbit above the blue planet, wrapped in a bending field that made it invisible to the primitive radar systems below. The hull was cold and dark. The lights inside were dim, kept low because the Solhari had eyes that were very sensitive to bright light. Everything about the ship was careful, quiet, and controlled. The Solhari liked things that way. Senior researcher Dravik stood at the main observation window. He was tall, with gray-green skin and 4 long fingers on each hand. His eyes were wide and pale, built for seeing in the low light of his home planet. He had been stationed on the Kelvorn for 11 years. In that time, he had filed over 2,000 reports about the species below. Most of those reports said the same thing in different ways. The humans were noisy. The humans were wasteful. The humans fought each other constantly. The humans built things and then knocked them down. The humans were, by every measurement the Galactic Consortium used, a species that was slowly burning itself out. That was the official position. Class 3 pre-contact. Unlikely to reach the stars. Unlikely to survive long enough to become a problem for anyone. Dravik believed that. He had believed it for 11 years. Then Tekshin called him over. Tekshin was the youngest member of the observation crew. He had only been on the ship for 8 months, sent fresh from the Consortium's research academy. He was small even by Solhari standards, with nervous hands that always seemed to be moving. He spent more time watching the human feeds than anyone else on the ship. The older crew members found this strange. Dravik had assumed it was just the curiosity of a new researcher who had not yet learned to keep a proper distance. But when Tekshin called him over that evening, his voice was different. It was not excited in the way young researchers got excited over new data. It was quiet, uncertain. "Senior researcher," Tekshin said, "I need you to look at this." The feed was coming from the continent the humans called North America. A large area of land in the southwest was on fire, not an unusual thing. Humans had wildfires often, but at the same time, the weather system over the coast had grown into what the humans called a Category 4 hurricane. 2 disasters happening close together. The sensors were already flagging the area as a high-casualty zone. Dravik had seen reports like this before. He expected to watch the humans flee. That was what living things did. That was what every species in the consortium did. You moved away from fire. You moved away from storms. You found shelter and you waited. He watched the feed. The humans were not fleeing. Trucks were moving toward the fire. Big red trucks with long hoses and spinning lights. Smaller vehicles followed them. People were running on foot in bright yellow suits, carrying equipment, moving in organized groups toward the flames. And behind them, behind the fire, the sky was turning dark and green from the hurricane that was still coming. The wind was already strong enough to bend the tall trees sideways. Rain was starting to fall in hard sheets. And still, the humans in the yellow suits kept going forward. Dravik watched in silence for a long time. "They are going toward it," Tekshin said quietly. "Both of them, the fire and the storm, they are going toward both." "I can see that," Dravik said. "Why?" Dravik did not answer. He did not have an answer. He had studied this species for 11 years. He knew their biology. He knew their brain chemistry. He knew that, like every other sapient species in the known galaxy, they had a fear response. When a living thing experienced danger, the body released chemicals that told it to run, to hide, to get away from the thing that could kill it. This was not a theory. It was a fact of life across dozens of worlds. Fear kept species alive. Fear was smart. Fear was, in a very real biological sense, what kept a species from disappearing. The humans in the yellow suits were clearly afraid. The sensors could pick up elevated heart rates even from orbit. Their bodies were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. Their blood was moving fast. Their muscles were ready to run. And they were running toward a burning mountain in the middle of a hurricane. Dravik turned to the young researcher. Pull up the last 6 months of incident recordings. Tag every event where a measurable danger was present and filter for human behavioral responses. Tection nodded and began working. The rest of the observation crew had drifted over by now. They stood in a loose group around the main feed without anyone asking them to. There was something about what they were watching that made it hard to look away. On the screen, a human figure in a yellow suit stopped at the edge of a burning tree line. The flames were close. The heat sensors on the Kelvorn registered temperatures that would have killed most species on contact. The human stood there for 3 seconds. Just 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, Dravik watched the human's head turn toward another person who had fallen behind, a younger one who had stopped moving and was standing still with their arms wrapped around themselves. The first human went back toward the fallen one, not forward toward safety. They grabbed the younger person by the arm, said something. The sensors could not pick up sound clearly through the storm, but the body language was clear. It was steady. It was calm. And then both of them went forward together, into the smoke, into the fire in the middle of a hurricane. Dravik stood very still. "This is not normal," one of the other researchers said softly from behind him. Her name was Orville. She had been on the ship for 4 years and she spoke carefully, always measuring her words. "No species does this. Not like this." "Maybe it is a soldier caste," someone else suggested. "Many species develop specialized subgroups for dangerous tasks." "These are not soldiers," Tection said. He had already been pulling records. He turned his screen so the others could see. "This one," he pointed to the figure that had gone back for the younger human, "her public records show she is a fire response worker, a civilian. She chose this as her daily work. She was not assigned to it. She was not born into a caste. She applied for it. She wanted to do it." The room was quiet again. Dravik walked back to his console. He opened the official report that he had been filling out before Tection had called him over. It was a routine report, mostly about agricultural patterns in the eastern part of the continent. He closed it. He opened a new file. At the top, he typed the observation classification header, and then he changed the status tag from where it had sat for 11 years. Routine monitoring was deleted. He typed, "Anomalous behavior, active study required." He looked at the feed one more time. The fire was still burning. The storm was still coming. And somewhere in the smoke and the wind, the humans in the yellow suits were still going forward. He sent the new file to the consortium's research division and leaned back in his chair. Above the planet, the Kelvorn drifted silently through the dark. The research bay was the largest room on the Kelvorn. It smelled like recycled air and warm equipment. The walls were covered in screens, and most of those screens were now showing human footage, old recordings pulled from the ship's 40 years of archived observation data. The crew had not slept much in 3 days. Nobody had asked them to keep working. They just kept working. Dravik stood at the center console, reviewing the classification filters that Tection had built. The system was sorting through decades of footage, pulling out every recorded moment where a human had encountered something that the consortium's biological models would classify as a lethal or near-lethal threat. The list was already long. Every entry had a predicted behavioral response attached to it, generated automatically by the ship's analysis software. The predicted response was almost always the same: flight, retreat, avoidance behavior, subject expected to move away from threat. Almost every entry was marked with a red flag. The flag meant the predicted behavior had not matched the observed behavior. Orville was working through a subset of the data at a side console. She had been focused on a single category for most of the morning: humans who had survived dangerous events, and then, after recovery, voluntarily returned to the same type of danger. She pulled up the first case and read it aloud for the room. A human male, middle age. He had been struck by lightning while walking across an open field. The electrical charge had stopped his heart. Other humans nearby had performed an emergency procedure on his chest that restarted it. He had spent weeks in a medical facility recovering. The damage to his nervous system had been significant. By all biological logic, this event should have created a deep and permanent fear of open spaces, storms, and electrical weather. 18 months after the strike, he had joined a group of humans who deliberately drove vehicles into the path of large storm systems to study them. The room was quiet while Orville read that last line. "He survived lightning," said a researcher near the back wall, an older Solhari named Brenlock who rarely spoke unless he was certain of what he wanted to say. And then he decided to go looking for more storms. He said in an interview, Orville continued, reading from the archived transcript, that after the strike he felt like storms were, and this is his word, beautiful. Nobody responded to that. There was nothing to say. Tekshin moved on to his next case. A human female, a competitive athlete who swam in open water. She had been attacked by a large ocean predator. The humans called it a great white shark, and had lost her left leg below the knee. She had nearly died. The recovery had taken over a year. The psychological review in her medical record used words like trauma and adjustment disorder. 2 years after the attack, she competed in an open water swimming race in the ocean. She finished in the top 10. Dravik typed slowly as the cases kept coming. Human soldiers who had been through combat, documented with clear signs of psychological damage, who had signed forms to go back to war. Humans who lived on the slopes of volcanoes that had already erupted in their lifetimes, who rebuilt their houses in the same spot after the lava cooled. Humans who worked in deep underground caves, in mines that collapsed regularly, in fishing boats that went out into waters that killed dozens of their kind every year, and came back the next season. He ran the pattern through the consortium's behavioral modeling software. The software was one of the most advanced tools the Galactic Consortium had built for xenobiology. It had been used to accurately predict the behavioral evolution of over 60 sapient species. It could take a species' brain chemistry, fear response data, social structure, and environmental history, and produce a detailed map of how that species would respond to threat and danger over time. The software processed the human data for 4 hours. The result came back with a blinking symbol at the top of the report that Dravik had never seen in 11 years of using the program. He leaned forward and read the label next to the symbol. Input parameters incompatible with known sapient survival behavior. Results may be unreliable. Manual review recommended. He read it twice. Then he called Brenlock over. Brenlock read it. Then he called Orville. She read it. Then everyone in the room gathered around the screen and read it, one by one, in silence. The software had never produced that error before. It had been designed to handle extreme outliers. It had processed species that ate toxic materials, species that reproduced through methods that caused the parent organism significant harm, species that fought each other in ritual combat for reasons that seemed completely irrational. It had handled all of those without producing an error. The humans had broken it. Maybe the data set is too large, someone suggested. Tekshin shook his head. He had already checked. The data set was within normal parameters. The software had no problem with the size. The problem was the content. Dravik walked to the narrow window at the end of the research bay and looked down at the planet below. It was day on the eastern side of the continent they called Europe. The sensors were picking up ordinary human activity, traffic, agriculture, industrial movement. From up here it all looked so small and slow and harmless. He thought about the error message, incompatible with known sapient survival behavior. He thought about what that meant precisely. The consortium had made contact with dozens of species across centuries of space exploration. Every single one of those species, without exception, had a biological ceiling on courage. Not a moral ceiling, a biological one. When the fear signal in the brain reached a high enough level, the body simply would not move forward. It was like a wall. every living thing had it. It was what kept species from walking off cliffs, from swimming toward predators, from standing in fires. The wall was not a weakness. The wall was ancient. The wall was built into the very structure of life. The humans seemed to have no wall. Or they had one, and they had learned to climb over it. Dravik turned back to the room. "I'm sending this data to Elder Vasra," he said. Vasra was the consortium's leading xenopsychologist. She was very old and very rarely responded quickly to anything. She received thousands of research submissions every cycle. He sent the file. 6 hours later, an extraordinarily short response time for an elder of her standing, a single message came back. It contained no analysis, no questions, no requests for additional data. Just one sentence. "I am coming to see this for myself." Dravik read the message. He read it again. Then he looked back at the screens covering the walls of the research bay, filled with footage of humans walking into fires, swimming in dangerous waters, rebuilding on broken ground. He had the quiet and unsettling feeling that everything the consortium thought it knew about this species was about to need rewriting. Elder Vasra was not what the younger crew members had expected. They had expected someone formal, someone who spoke in long, careful sentences filled with scientific terms. Most high-ranking consortium scholars were like that. They wore their seniority the way armor was worn, visibly, deliberately, meant to be noticed. Vasra was short and moved slowly and said very little when she first came aboard. She had deep gray eyes that looked older than the rest of her face. She walked through the Kelvorn without asking for a tour, found the research bay on her own, sat down at the main observation console, and began reading through everything the crew had collected. She did not speak for almost 2 full days. When she finally looked up, she asked one question. "Which one do you watch most?" The crew looked at each other. Tekshin raised his hand a little, the way young researchers did when they were not sure if they were allowed to answer. "There is a human on the western continent," he said, "a fire response worker. She has been active in several of our most significant incident recordings over the past 3 months. Vasra nodded. "Show me her." Her name, according to the public records the Kelvorn sensors had collected from surface communications, was Dana Reyes. She was 28 years old. She had dark hair that she kept short under her work helmet. She was not particularly large by human standards. The sensors put her at average height, average build. There was nothing about her physical appearance that suggested she was built for the kind of work she did. She had served in the human military for 4 years before becoming a fire response worker. She had been in active combat. She had been injured once. A piece of metal debris had cut deep into her left shoulder, and after 3 months of recovery she had returned to her unit. After leaving the military, she had applied immediately for the fire service. Her application paperwork, intercepted through the planet's open communication networks, described her reason for joining in 4 words: "I want to help people." The crew observed her for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, Dana Reyes ran into 4 burning buildings, assisted in evacuating a collapsed structure after a gas explosion, helped carry an injured colleague down the side of a steep mountain in near darkness, and on one quiet afternoon, sat with an elderly human who had lost his home to fire and held the man's hand while he cried. Elder Vasra watched all of it without writing a single note for the first 2 weeks. She simply watched. On the 3rd week, she asked Tekshin to run the biological sensor data in real time during Dana's next active call. The sensors on the Kelvorn could measure certain biological signals from the surface, not perfectly, but clearly enough to read heart rate, body temperature, and the rough chemical signatures of major neurological activity. Cortisol, adrenaline, the markers of the fear response. The call came on a Tuesday by the human calendar, a factory fire in the middle of a city. Large building, multiple floors, civilians still inside. Dana's crew was dispatched. The sensors tracked her as she suited up. as she rode in the red vehicle with the lights and the noise, as she stepped out onto the street in front of the burning building. Vasra watched the biological data feed. The numbers were not subtle. Dana's heart rate had nearly doubled. Her adrenaline levels were extremely high. The cortisol signature was spiking in patterns that the sensor system automatically labeled as acute stress response severe. In the consortium's biological framework, that level of fear chemistry was associated with a state called threat paralysis, the point at which an organism's body essentially locked itself into stillness or retreat. It was the body's final warning system. A signal that said, "Do not go further, this is the edge." Dana Reyes walked through the front door of the burning building. Vasra sat very still at the console. She did not speak. The data kept coming. Inside the building, the readings got worse. The heat was immense. The sensors registered the air temperature around Dana as high enough to cause rapid skin burns in an unprotected organism. Her fear chemistry was still climbing. Her heart rate was at a level that would have caused most species to lose physical coordination. She moved fast and steady through the smoke. She communicated constantly with her crew through a radio device, short and clear sentences, telling them where she was, what she saw, what she needed. There was nothing in her voice that sounded like the numbers on the screen. She sounded focused, almost calm. She found 2 humans on the second floor, an adult and a child, hiding in a small room where the smoke was thinner. She covered them with a protective sheet from her equipment pack, spoke to them for a few seconds, and then moved them toward the stairs. The child was crying. Dana kept one hand on the child's back the entire way down. They came out of the building into the cold air outside. Other crew members took the adult and child. Dana turned around and looked back at the building. For 3 seconds, she stood completely still. Texan's voice was barely above a whisper. "She is thinking about going back in." He was right. The radio communication confirmed it a moment later. She was reporting to her commander that she believed there was at least one more person on the 3rd floor. Her commander told her the floor was too unstable. She pushed back. Her commander held firm. Dana stood outside the building for another 10 seconds, watching the upper windows, before the structure groaned loudly and a section of the 3rd floor collapsed inward. She took 1 step toward it. Her commander grabbed her arm. She stopped. Vasra finally spoke. She knew it was going to collapse. The sensor data on structural integrity was flagging it for over a minute before it fell, Texan confirmed. She would have had access to similar readings on her own equipment. She knew, Vasra said again, more quietly this time, and she still wanted to go. The rest of the crew did not respond. There was nothing comfortable to say. Vasra sat back in her chair and looked at the feed, where Dana was now sitting on the bumper of the vehicle, helmet off, her face dark with smoke, accepting a cup of something hot from another crew member. A journalist had appeared at the edge of the scene. She was asking Dana a question. The audio feed was not clear, but the word "afraid" appeared in the automated transcription. Dana answered. The transcription read, "Yeah, every time, you be stupid not to be." The journalist asked another question. The transcription, "Then why do you keep doing it?" Dana looked at the journalist for a moment. Then she looked at the building. The fire was still burning in the upper floors. She took a slow sip from her cup. The transcription read, "Because somebody has to." Vasra stared at that line for a long time. Then she closed her notepad, looked at Dravik, and said very quietly, "I have studied living minds for 60 years. I have no framework for this. I have no word for what she is." She paused. "I need to build one." The Kelvorn had been quiet in a different way since Vasra arrived. Before, the crew had worked with the calm, professional distance that the consortium's training required. Observe, record, classify, don't attach. That was the rule for pre-contact species monitoring. You were not supposed to feel anything about the creatures you were watching. They were data. They were a file number in a database. They were Class 3 pre-contact, primitive and far from the stars. Now the crew sat in the research bay for hours at a time without anyone asking them to. They ate at their consoles. They watched the human feeds the way, Dravik thought, the humans themselves sometimes watched fires, unable to look away even when it made them feel something difficult. Vasra noticed. She said nothing about it. She was doing the same thing. She had begun building a new theoretical model. The question she was trying to answer was not simply why do humans approach danger. That was the surface question. The deeper question, the one that kept pulling at her, was what force inside them is stronger than the fear. She started with the obvious theories, the ones any first-year researcher would try, and she dismissed them one by one. The first theory was ignorance. Perhaps the humans simply did not understand that they were going to die. Perhaps their ability to imagine their own death was limited in some important way. She pulled their cultural records, their literature, their art, their religions, their recorded history. Every human culture, without exception, had built elaborate systems around the fact of death. They wrote about it constantly. They made ceremonies for it. They had entire philosophies dedicated to how to face it. An old human text that the translation software estimated was nearly 2,500 years old described death as the one certainty in all of life. The humans knew exactly what death was. They had always known. Ignorance was not the answer. The second theory was coercion. Perhaps certain humans were forced into dangerous roles by more powerful members of their society. Threat hierarchies existed in many species. Weaker individuals were pushed into dangerous tasks so stronger ones could survive. Dravik had proposed this theory early in the study, and it was reasonable on its surface. But the data did not support it. The fire worker, Dana Reyes, had applied voluntarily. The soldier cases in the archive, the ones who had re-enlisted after combat injury, had signed their own forms. Many of the most extreme examples involved humans who faced danger with no authority above them at all. An old man who ran into a neighbor's burning house. A young woman who jumped into a river to pull out a child she had never met. A man who pushed a stranger out of the path of a fast vehicle and broke his own arm doing it. Nobody told them to. Nobody threatened them. Nobody rewarded them in any measurable way. Coercion was not the answer. Orville had been running a separate line of research since the second week, quietly and without fanfare. She had been studying human social bonding, the way humans formed connections with each other. She brought her findings to Vasra on a quiet evening when most of the crew was resting. They bond to each other very quickly, Orville said. She was speaking carefully, the way she always did, but there was something in her voice that was hard to name. By most species standards, the bond formation is almost immediate, and the bonds are not limited in the way we would expect. Vasra looked at her. Explain. Most species bond most strongly to genetic relatives or close long-term social partners. The bond strength drops sharply with distance and unfamiliarity. It is survival logic. You protect your bloodline and your close group because they carry your genes, they know your signals, they keep you safe in return. Orville paused. Humans do this also, but the drop is not sharp. It is very gradual, and in some cases, she pulled up a recording, it disappears almost entirely. The recording was from a human news archive. A disaster in a coastal region, flooding after a large storm. The rescue footage showed ordinary humans, people with no special training, wading into chest-deep water to pull strangers to higher ground. In the background, a human was seen carrying a dog, not his dog, the records confirmed. He had no dog over his head through fast-moving current. An elderly woman was seen handing her food supply to a family she had never met before, keeping nothing for herself. They were afraid, Orville said. The biological data we have from similar events confirms it. They were afraid and exhausted, and many of them had lost everything they owned. And they still looked around for someone who needed more help than they did. The room was very quiet. It was Tekshan who said it. He had been sitting in the corner of the room, listening, and when he spoke, Everyone turned toward him because his voice sounded different, softer, like someone who had just understood something for the first time. "They are not doing it for themselves," he said. "None of them, not the fire worker, not the soldiers, not the man in the flood with the dog. They are doing it for each other, even when the other is a stranger, even when there is no benefit to themselves at all." He stood up and walked to the main screen. He pulled up a clip he had saved 3 days ago but had not shared yet. He had not known how to share it. It was a small recording. No disaster, no crisis. A mountain trail, somewhere in the region the humans called Central America. A human man, walking alone, had come across an animal trapped under a fallen branch. The animal was small, with large round eyes and slow movements. The consortium's biological catalog identified it as a loris, a nocturnal primate that posed no threat and had no value as food or resource. The man spent 40 minutes clearing the branch. He was not careful about his own hands. He cut them on the bark and did not stop. When the animal was free, it was injured. The man took off his outer jacket, wrapped the animal in it, and carried it against his chest for 3 kilometers down the mountain in pouring rain. He was laughing for part of it, not in a mocking way. In the way humans laughed when something was both very hard and very good at the same time. When he reached the road, he flagged down a vehicle and asked to be taken to a facility that cared for injured animals. His hands were still bleeding when he handed the animal over. Nobody had asked him to do it. Nobody was watching. There was no reward. The animal could not thank him in any way he could understand. He did it because the animal needed it. Vasra sat with that thought for a long time. Then she opened her report to the consortium, the one she had been writing since she arrived on the ship. She had been writing it carefully in the formal language of academic xenobiology. She deleted most of what she had written. She began again, in plainer words. She changed the human species classification from Class 3 pre-contact to Class 6 unpredictable. She attached a note that the standard classification system had no category that fit what they had observed. She recommended that the consortium create one. In the section for behavioral summary, she wrote a single paragraph. She wrote that the crew of the Kelvorn had observed a species that felt fear fully and completely, that understood death clearly and completely, and that had developed a social bond so strong it could override both. She wrote that this bond did not stop at family, or at community, or even at species. She wrote that in her 60 years of xenopsychological research, she had never encountered anything like it. She wrote that the Galactic Consortium needed to take this seriously. She sent the report. Then she went back to the screen and watched the human feeds for a long time in the dim light of the research bay, surrounded by the quiet crew of the Kelvorn, all of them watching together, none of them saying a word. The grand chamber of the Galactic Consortium was built to hold silence. The room was enormous. The ceiling was so high that the upper walls disappeared into shadow. The seats were arranged in a wide circle, tiered upward on all sides so that every delegate could see every other delegate. 12 species were represented. Some sat in environmental suits. Some breathed filtered air. Some required specific lighting conditions. The consortium had been meeting in this chamber for over 3 centuries. It had made decisions here that shaped the futures of dozens of worlds. Today it was debating one small planet that did not even know this room existed. Vasra stood at the center podium. She had presented her findings over the course of 3 hours, methodically and without drama. She had shown the footage. She had shown the biological data. She had walked the delegates through every theory the Kelvorn crew had tested and eliminated. She had presented Orville's bonding research and Texan's compiled incident archive. She had shown them Dana Ray's walking into the burning building. She had shown them the man in the rain with the loris. Then she had made her recommendation, first contact. The chamber had not been quiet since. The delegate from the Veth, a species that looked like tall birds with 4 arms, spoke first and spoke loudly. The Veth were not prone to fear themselves. They were a competitive and physical species, but they understood strategic thinking. A species, the Veth delegate argued, with no biological ceiling on courage, with social bonds that extended even to strangers and other species, that felt real fear and chose to ignore it. What did that species become when it reached the stars? What happened when they met something that genuinely threatened them? Not a fire, not a flood, an enemy with weapons, a threat that did not go away. We have managed dozens of first contacts, the Veth delegate said. None of those species were like this. The ones who were aggressive because they were afraid. Take away the fear and you take away the aggression. But these humans, they are not aggressive because they are afraid. They are brave because they love each other. And that is something we do not know how to predict. Several delegates nodded. Several others were already pulling up their own notes. The delegate from the Ori spoke next. The Ori were small and ancient, one of the founding species of the consortium. Their delegate was very old and spoke slowly, with long pauses between thoughts. "We have been here before," the old delegate said. "Not exactly here, but close." He paused. "The Veldrath collapse, the Oran plague, the siege of the 9 moons. In every one of those events, the consortium survived because someone ran toward the crisis instead of away from it. A single ship that turned back. A single researcher who stayed in the contamination zone to finish the cure. A single commander who held a position that everyone else had abandoned." Another pause. "We have always needed those individuals. We find them rarely. We lose them faster than we find them. And we have spent 300 years wondering if there was a species, a whole species, that thought the way those individuals thought." He let that sit in the air for a moment. "We may have found one." The debate went on for many hours. Voices rose and fell. Arguments were made about security protocols, about cultural contamination, about the human species' own internal conflicts. They were still fighting each other, still divided in many ways, still years from any space travel of their own. Some delegates argued that beginning contact before they reached that level themselves would be irresponsible. Some argued the opposite, that leaving them alone until they developed weapons capable of interstellar reach would be far more dangerous. Dravik was present in the observation gallery above the main floor. He had not expected to be invited, but Vasra had put his name on the access list. He sat beside Tekshin and Oraval and watched the debate. He had been to the Grand Chamber once before, years ago, for a different matter. He had found it impressive then. Now he found it very small in a way he had not expected. All these brilliant minds, all this ancient authority, trying to make a decision about a species they had watched for 40 years without ever once speaking to. He thought about Dana Reyes sitting on the bumper of the red vehicle with her cup of something hot, face covered in smoke, answering a journalist's question with 4 words, "Because somebody has to." He thought about the man in the rain laughing, while he carried a hurt animal through the dark. He thought about the young fire worker going back for the colleague who had stopped moving at the edge of the burning tree line, not leaving without them, choosing to be slower and less safe, because being alone in the danger was apparently not the point. The vote was called after the 7th hour of debate. 6 votes for contact, 6 votes against. The chamber went very still. Vasra, as the presenting researcher, was given the deciding vote. It was a procedural rule, rarely used, meant for exactly this kind of deadlock. She stood at the center podium again. She looked around the chamber, at all 12 species, at all the ancient weight of the consortium's caution and history and careful logic. She cast her vote. For contact. Below, in the part of the world the humans called California, the day was ending. Dana Reyes was sitting on the hood of a fire truck. Her shift had been long. There had been a brush fire in the hills east of the city, pushed by dry wind, and her crew had spent 8 hours working the line. The fire was out now. The hillside behind her was black and still smoking in thin gray ribbons against the orange sky. She had her boots off. Her feet hurt. She had a bad scrape along her right forearm that she hadn't noticed until the adrenaline wore off. One of the younger crew members had wrapped it with a bandage during the drive back and told her to get it properly cleaned later. She had said she would. She probably would. She was watching the sunset. Her radio crackled. Another call. Smaller this time, a structural fire in the valley, all units requested in support. She looked at the radio. She looked at the sky. She looked at the black hillside that her crew had just saved from burning any further, the houses on the ridge that were still standing because 8 people had spent a very long day making sure they would be. She took a slow breath. She reached for her boots. Up above her, higher than any cloud, invisible against the dark that was spreading from the east, the Kelvorn had changed course. It was moving now in a long, slow arc that would bring it lower, not to land. Not yet, just closer. Dravik had been watching the surface feed since the vote. He watched Dana pull her boots on. He watched her stand up from the hood of the truck, roll her shoulders back, and walk toward the vehicle door. He watched her say something to her crew that made 2 of them laugh. He had watched humans for 11 years. He had filed thousands of reports. He had classified them as primitive and unlikely to matter. He understood now that he had been watching them without really seeing them. There was a difference. He had seen the data but not the thing behind the data. He had seen the behavior but not the reason for it. He had watched them run into fires and thought it was strange. He had not understood that it was not strange to them at all. It was just who they were. It was the most natural thing in the world to them. To look around, find the person or the creature or the thing that was in the most trouble and go toward it. He kept watching as the Kelvorn drifted silently down through the high, cold dark above the planet. The humans had no idea what was coming. They did not know that 12 species had just voted on their future. They did not know that an ancient chamber had spent 7 hours arguing about whether they were dangerous or extraordinary. They did not know that in the end, an old xenopsychologist who had studied living minds for 60 years had made her decision based on a man in the rain, carrying a small hurt animal, laughing because it was hard and good at the same time. They just kept going, into the fires and the storms and the broken places, for each other, for strangers, for small animals with big eyes, for all the people they had never met and might never meet who needed someone to show up. They had never needed a reason bigger than that. They never would.